Good morning, students. Today our lesson is about transport and communication. I am on page 128 and this is lesson 4. So in this lesson we will explain how transportation and communication have influenced our economic activities and learn how technology has increased independence or interdependence between our region and the world. In this picture here, we see different types of transportations. We see an aeroplane here, a train, a ship, and we see people on every level. We see trucks and goods being transported by trucks. We see cars and bicycles, and we see buses here at the bottom, okay? So these are all different types of transportation. Now, transportation has developed a lot over the centuries and over the years. So the evolution of transportation in ancient times, if you can follow with me on page 128, in ancient times people used to make use of horses, camels, carts, boats and ships for their transportation, okay? And then in the 1800s we introduced steam trains and steam ships, okay? And then in the 1900s we started seeing the introduction of cars, planes and many other forms of transportation. Okay, so I am on page 128 and we are looking at the first block here, which is ancient times, okay? So on page 128, in ancient times the forms of transportation used to be horses, camels, animal-drawn carts, boats and ships. You can see the pictures on your page, on page 128. There you see someone on a camel, you see someone on a horse, you see someone on a boat there. You see a cart that is drawn by a horse or a donkey. And then you see a ship that is directed with a wind sail, okay? So these ships were not driven in the ways that we operate our ships in today's time. Back in the day, they used to have a ship with a simple sail, and these sails would allow the ship to move with wind, okay? So what types of economic developments happened that allowed us to use these different types of sorts of transportation? They used to have, as an economic activity, they used to have stables and inns along transport routes. Now what are stables and inns? A stable is a place where your horse or your camel or whatever animal you have could rest for the day or for the night, okay? They would also get fed here in these stables. So it's like a hotel for animals or for horses and camels, okay? And then an inn is a hotel, a place where people can rest for the night. So they used to have these along the transport routes, so people could break their travel up into over days, and wherever they would feel tired or so, they would go to these inns. And at the inns they would also have stables so that the people's horses and camels could also rest. Then we learned about this previously. They had port cities to supply boats with supplies. Example, Aden. Do you girls remember in Yemen on the map on page, let me just find it for you quickly. On page it was in unit 2 on page 47 and page 45 we learned about the port of Aden. Now this was along the trade routes from the European cities to India. Do you remember? So at these port cities, what is a port city? It's a place where ships, just like a hotel for people, where ships could dock overnight, or they could dock there for a couple of hours. They could stay in the harbor for a couple of hours to supply the boats with supplies. Okay, so for instance, if it was a trading ship, they would pick up some materials at Aden here, or they would supply the boat with fuel, or they would get food supplies here, and then they can carry on with the rest of their trip again. Okay, then we have canals and waterways for river boats. We've discussed this in great detail when we discussed the Suez Canal. So they created canals and waterways through which ships could travel, or boats could travel. Okay, and then they also had small harbors for sea crafts. A harbor is a place along the coast, along the sea, at certain strategic locations, at city places. They have small harbors where ships could come and people could load the ships with supplies, or the ships could be serviced. That means that they could fix whatever might have been broken on the ship. Okay, so those were the economic developments in ancient times, and these were the forms of transportation. Nothing with engines and machines yet. Okay, so then in the 1800s we saw the introduction of steam. Okay, so the people would mine for coal back in the day, and this coal would be used to fuel the engines of the trains and the ships. So they would put coal in like an oven in the steam trains and the steam ships, and this coal would release energy which would drive the trains and the ships. Okay, so we saw an introduction of steam trains and steam ships. So instead of everything being done by horses and camels, or by animals, and by relying on the wind to make the ships move, now we had steam, and this steam powered the engines in such a way that these trains and ships could move now without people directing the ships, or relying on wind to move the ships. Okay, so what were the economic developments? Increased coal mining to fuel steam powered trains and ships, more trading between distant countries, so people had to travel further now, not just around the corner, they had to travel right across the world now, or that would be by ship, or people would use railway towns that could supply trains and passengers. So now in the countries they had railway lines now, so instead of people just traveling by horse and camel inside a country, now they could travel by train. That meant that now they could go further distances. Okay, so their trading didn't just stop between towns now, or walking distance. Now they could go from Jeddah to Dammam. Okay, because they had different means of transportations, or they could go from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, or from Egypt to India. People could travel further distances now. Okay, and then in the 1900s, right, new forms of transportation were introduced. Now we see cars, planes, and other forms of transportation. What economic developments occurred during this time? Now people were drilling for oil and other fuels. So what did the oil industry do? Now we could have cars, right? Cars that were fueled with the oil or petroleum, so that these cars could be operated faster. Okay, now people were building roads and airports and parking areas, so that's also an economic development. So people got new jobs now. They got jobs at airports, they were building parking areas, they were building roads. People had big factories now because of the Industrial Revolution. and they had to transport goods from factories to the markets. So they had to transport the goods from where they manufactured it or where they produced it in a factory, and they had to take it to the market where people can come and buy it. Okay, the markets like Lulu hypermarket, like Panda, and so forth, and clothing shops like Zara and H&M. Those are all marketplaces. So they had to transport the goods from the factories to all of these shops where we can have access to it, where we can buy it. Okay, and then people also travel for leisure via planes or cars, just like how we do when it's vacation. We travel for leisure. That means that we travel to go and have fun. Okay, you don't just go for working, you go to rest and to enjoy. So those are your different types of transportation and the way that it has developed over the years. What we discussed now was the evolution of transportation from ancient times to the 1800s to the 1900s, and we also saw which type of economic activities occurred during each of these different eras of transportation. Okay, now on page, first of all, can you think about more economic developments that came with the invention of modern forms of transportation? Do you girls remember the word tourism? If anyone can tell me about tourism and tell me how tourism relies on transportation. Okay, now I am on page 130. Now in Saudi Arabia they introduced railroads. Okay, what are railroads? Railroads are, you know, the tracks on which a train runs. Now that is a railroad. I will post a video in YouTube too, so that you can see what a railroad looks like. Okay, if you've ever taken a train from Dammam to Riyadh, or from Dammam to Upcake, or from Dammam to Hafuf, then you would know what a train is, and you would have seen how the train travels. Okay, it travels on a railroad. So now if you are with me on page 130, we see that the first railway was built in 1908, and this was to join Jordan to Medina. So I'm reading on page 130. The first railway opened in 1908, joining the border of Jordan to Medina. Then in 1915, that same railway shuts down. Okay, and then in 1951, I will read on page 130, the first modern railway opens for the transportation of oil and goods for Aramco from the Arabian Gulf ports to warehouses in Tehran. So if we look on our map, this is the Arabian Gulf. Okay, so they have different ports all along the Arabian Gulf. Remember, a port is a place where ships can come and stand. Okay, and they can offload supplies and they can load supplies onto the ships. Okay, so all along the coast, most likely at Jubail and the Khubar coast here, ships would come and they would bring supplies, and then these supplies via the train would have to go to the different Aramco facilities, especially to the warehouses in Tehran. A warehouse is a place where they keep supplies, okay, that they need for production. So on this map here, it shows the current railway lines in Saudi Arabia, as well as the lines that are being planned or constructed. So now this is our legend, okay, our map key. On this map key here, they say that the yellow lines show us current railways. So that means a railway that is operational and that we can use. Here they show us that the lines that are green, red and blue are planned or under construction. So that means they are not operational yet, but they are still in the planning. They are still busy constructing these types of railways. And then a line that has different types of colors, these lines are no longer in use. That means that was a railway, but it's no longer operating. And in this slide here, we discussed such a railway, and we said it's from Jordan to Medina. This railway shut down in 1915. That means that it's no longer working. Okay, so let's look at the map here. If we look here, from Jordan to Medina, you see that this railway line is no longer in use. They don't use it anymore. And then we look for our green, red and blue lines. Can you see these ones here? All along here, this is green. These ones are still being planned. They are not operating yet. And then we have, luckily for us, it's here in Dammam, and it connects Riyadh, Dammam, Hafuf, Al-Kharj and Harat. This railway line here is active and people can travel here. I know that many of you travel from Dammam to Riyadh. Many weekends you go and you visit your relatives here. So some of you take the train and you go via the train to Riyadh. Or some of you go to Al-Hassa. So you take the train to Al-Hassa. So that is a train that is operational. Now, there's a small activity on the bottom of the page. They tell us to find your city or village on the map. Many of us live in Khubar and Dammam, so we are here. Okay, can you see my cursor? That's where we are. So they tell us, where can you go by train from your home? We can travel with a train to Abqaiq, to Al-Hafuf, to Harad, to Al-Kharj, and we can go to Riyadh with the train. Where will you be able to go once all the new railway lines are completed? So if we wanted to travel via train, and if all these railway lines are completed, we can take the train all the way to Al-Taif, Khamis, Jazan, Makkah, Jeddah, Medina, Yanbu, Tabuk. Okay, wait, this railway line is no longer in use. So we can go all the way to Medina. We can go to Buraida, Hail, Al Jubail, and so forth. Okay, so those are all the places that we would be able to go to. Let me just pause this video just for 1 second and I'll get back to you just now. Okay, so I'm back. So now we discussed the railways or the railroads in Saudi Arabia, and we discussed how we can use the train system to get to different places in Saudi Arabia. That's very nice, right? So we have different types of transportation here in Saudi Arabia. We can travel by car, by train, and we can travel by aeroplane. Now going to my next slide, we see on page 131 that more than ever before in the history of the world, people are using a lot of transport, and one particular transportation that is used quite a lot is cars. So people drive more cars now than ever before in human history. And here we see some data. It's also on page 131 in your book. Vehicles per 1,000 people in the USA and some selected countries. Okay, so here we see that how it has grown. So the blue line here shows you how many people drove in 1996, and then the red line shows you how many people drove in 2007, how many people had vehicles in 2007. So out of 1,000 people in 1996, Here we can see that about 780 people had cars out of 1,000 people, okay? That's 78% of the people who had cars. Then in the year 2007 in the USA, you can see more than 800 people out of 1,000 had cars. So we saw an increase of about 30% of people now using cars in America. In Africa, I come from Africa and I know this, that we are still a developing continent, and unfortunately, in comparison to more developed countries like the USA and Canada and the Pacific here, not a lot of people can afford to have their own cars or their own vehicles in Africa, because most of Africa has villages, okay? I'm not talking about more developed countries like Egypt and South Africa, but a lot of places in Africa are still very underdeveloped. So here we can see that about 20 out of 1,000 people in Africa have vehicles, okay? But that's for the whole continent of Africa. And then here, Asia and the Far East, you have about between 50 and 70 people per 1,000 people in the country who have cars, okay? And then the map goes on like that. This is where Saudi Arabia would fall. We saw an increase in 1996. The people of Asia and the Middle East, about 70 people out of 1,000 were driving cars. And then we saw in 2007 that 100 out of 1,000 people had vehicles, okay? Let's compare that to this diagram that we have here. This is also information, the same dates, 1996 and 2007, okay? So here they show us Africa. In Africa in 1996, only 23.4 people had cars, okay, or vehicles. And then there was a slight increase in the year 2007. 24 out of 1,000 people had vehicles in 2007. Now let's look at the Middle East. The Middle East, out of 1,000 people, 67.8 of these people had vehicles. And then in 2007, 101.4 people had vehicles. So we see an overall increase, okay? In every one of these countries, there has been a significant increase. You see, in China, there was a dramatic increase between 1996 to 2007. In 1996, only 9.3 people out of 1,000 had or owned vehicles, and then in 2007, 30.3 people had vehicles, okay? Because in China, most people drive or ride bicycles, okay? But in places like the Middle East, where we can see a bigger number than in China, most people own vehicles. Yeah, in Europe and in the West, which would be countries like America as well, more people drive cars. So we can see that over the years, between the year 1996 and 2007 and up until now, there has been a big increase in the amount of cars, okay? So that means that there is a great demand on the car industry. So people must manufacture cars because more and more people are buying cars, okay? So there are questions at the bottom of this page on 131. What does the top graph show us, okay? What does the graph show us? So here we will simply look at the title of the map. And what does the title of the map say? Vehicles per 1,000 people in the USA, in the United States of America, and some selected countries. Okay, so that is what the map shows us, or the graph shows us. Okay, how do you think this has affected the Saudi economy? Okay, we can also say here that there has been an increase in vehicle usage over time. So how do you think this has affected the Saudi economy? Well, in Saudi Arabia, we produce oil, right? So that means that a greater demand has been placed on oil production because we need oil to fuel these cars, okay? And we also need fuel to make these cars. Which region had the smallest increase in number of vehicles per 1,000 people between 1996 and 2007? Sorry. So, we look at our map here. Can you see that in Africa, we had less than 7 people, a growth of less than 7. In the Far East, we have seen a growth of about 6, okay? In the Middle East, we see a growth of, this is a lot, we see more than 30 people here. So if we look at these numbers here, all of these numbers, we can see that the least growth has been in India, the Far East and Africa. So we can write here, between India and India, there was only a rise of, let me just take out my calculator, 12.3 minus 7.2, so that is 5.1 in India. In the Far East, 63.4 minus 57.1, that is 6.3. And in Africa, 23.4, no, 24 minus 23.4, 6, okay, just 1 minute. 24 minus 23.4, okay. So the least amount of cars or vehicles introduced into the system is in Africa. So what would our answer be here? Which region had the smallest increase in number of vehicles per 1,000 people between 1996 and 2007? Suggest a reason for this. So the area here would be Africa. And what would our reason be? Because Africa is largely underdeveloped, meaning that not a lot of people can afford to have their own vehicles, and many people still live in villages, okay, where they don't make use of vehicles yet, okay. And there's also a large amount of poverty in Africa. So we can also write here, one of the reasons can also be the poverty in Africa, okay. So that means that not a lot of people can afford to have their own vehicles in Africa. Okay, I'm going to page 132. Now we look at the developments in communication. I am reading on page 132. When we send and receive messages, we are communicating. The diagrams below show some different ways in which we can communicate. So on a daily basis, we communicate with people, okay? We communicate via WhatsApp. We communicate, you talking to your mother or your father, that is also communication. We talk in groups at school. So these are all different types of communication. And then communication also comes to us via the television, via advertisements, via YouTube. The king sometimes he makes a public address, and that is also a form of communication. I will just go through my list here, which is the same list that you have on page 132, okay? So communication, the sending and receiving of messages, and the forms are conversation in person, that is when you are talking to your friend, okay, or to your mother or your father or your siblings. And then speaking to a group, that is most often what teachers do. They speak to a group of people, right? And even in meetings, people also speak to a group of people. And then a lot of us have telephone conversations. We have television broadcasts where we can watch the news. That is also a form of communication. And then we have public address. That is when, for instance, like now with the case of coronavirus, right? Every now and then, the presidents or the kings of their countries would go onto television, or they would go to a stadium or a meeting, and they would address the nation, okay? They would give a speech that everyone must hear, and we call that a public address. And then many of us make use of email and instant messaging on social media as a means of communication. Now, on page 133, we can see that communication has also evolved over the years, okay? So we will be discussing that right now. Just one small point on the development of communication on page 132. There's questions at the bottom. What kinds of communication can you see in this page? So we've listed them here. We see people talking one person to another. We see people speaking to a group. We see telephone conversations, television broadcasts, public address, and social media. When do you see people using these kinds of communication? We've discussed it now when I told you about each different type of communication. This can be when you are at home, talking to your family. This could be at school when your teacher addresses the classroom. Telephone conversations, this happens right throughout the day, right? Television broadcasts, this can also be during the day when you watch the news. Public address, I told you now, like in the case of coronavirus, where the president or the king would address the nation. And most of us use email and instant messaging every day, okay? What other kinds of communication do you use? You can tell me on Class Era if there are any other types of communication that you use, okay? So now we go to page 133. Here on the page and on my slide, you see the early forms of communication. People used to make use of smoke signals where they would burn a fire and send smoke into the air, and that would tell someone else something, okay? That there might be an emergency there in that specific place. Blowing of horns. People usually used to blow horns in times of war and fighting. So the blowing of this horn would tell the nearby people that the war is coming, okay? That people are coming to fight. I am reading on page 133, and it says there that one of the disadvantages of early forms of communication was that both the sender and the receiver had to agree on the meanings of each signal in advance. For example, there would be a particular pattern of horn blows to mean the enemy is arriving. So it was impossible for them to send complicated messages. You can't send a fire signal up to ask someone, how are you doing? That would be misunderstood. If you had to send up a fire signal, immediately people would think that something is going wrong in the next village, okay? So you can't just send a fire signal up in the air just for fun. You couldn't just blow your horn just for fun, because then people would start getting ready for war. So you couldn't send any complicated messages. So that was a disadvantage. And then as the years progressed, we started seeing the introduction of telegraphs early telephones and radios. So all these were more complex types of communication where people could now call each other, or they could send a message across the country or across continents, or they could speak via the radio and people could listen to the news. I am reading on page 133. In the 1800s, the inventions of the telegraph and the telephone helped people to transmit more complex. That means you could send more information at a time, okay? Complex messages across greater distances. These inventions required long systems of wiring so that the messages could pass along the wires. So they made use of wires for this type of communication, okay? And then our current forms of communication, we use email and mobile phones like our cell phones, okay, and Gmail and Yahoo. We also make use of social media. We make use of email, yeah, as we said. We make use of instant messages, so that's when you send an SMS to someone, like SMS text messages, instant messages like on Facebook Messenger or Instagram or Facebook. And we also make use of email marketing, social media. So people usually say they DM each other, right? So that's a direct message in your Instagram or on your Twitter or on your Facebook. And then people also blog, so that is putting videos online. And people make use of voice calling by means of telephones, okay? So those are your newer types of communication. So girls, that is our lesson today about public transportation and private transportation and technology and communication, okay? I will post more videos about this topic in YouTube, okay? You can write comments to me to answer the questions that I asked you during this video. But for today, we do not have any homework. Remember that next week we will be doing our final lesson for the term, and then I will be hosting a virtual class session with you girls, okay? It will be either on Sunday or Monday. And thereafter, the week after that, we will be doing our revision exercise. And then after that, we will be having another virtual video to discuss the work of the term, okay? So I hope that you girls enjoyed this lesson. Please watch the rest of the videos on YouTube that I will be posting just now. Have a good day, and I will see you next week, okay? Bye bye.